Hello, hello, and more hello. So, today we have a topic that I know you've heard a lot about, but I don't think most people understand the context around it. Uh, I know you've heard like the terms gender ideology, gender theory, that sort of thing. Specifically, in politics, a lot of like right wing sources tend to talk about those terms. And they always seem to suggest that, like, the left is pushing these onto people. I know I hear it a lot when out and about, uh, people complaining about all this gender nonsense, as they tend to call it. But that is, in fact, not like the correct context. Uh, the context of the real origins are entirely right wing. Uh, it was created by right wing populists, conservative religious organizations, social conservatives, far right groups of various types, um, a few other categories that we're going to get into as I talk about this. But their goal is that things like gender equality, and that's not just like something for like LGBTQ. That is gender equality between just men and women. Uh, hurts them. So does LGBT rights. Any sort of gender studies, they object to all those things. Like at least one potential origin for like these concepts is actually an effort to like target gay marriage. But we'll get into it in a second. The whole the whole thing is yet another moral panic. If you've never heard of moral panics, uh, they they are a big thing in history. Used every time someone wants to demonize something else. Uh, I actually wanted to spotlight a few of them. The Red Scare, for instance, that was a moral panic. It was all about communism being the evil thing. Uh, and especially McCarthy just like did witch hunts for communists or suspected communists. Uh, Devil's Music, where they were complaining about early metal or even jazz in some cases. Uh, it's been brought up multiple times with different music. Blues, rock, all of those have had a moral panic about them. Uh, the Comics Code Authority was created because of a moral panic. Dungeons and Dragons being satanic was also a moral panic. HIV and AIDS were seen as a moral panic, basically targeting people that were gay. There are there are literally hundreds. In fact, there's a list. Yeah, there's a quite extensive list. I know you probably can't see the text itself, but moral panics are something that basically is always used by like the right wing. I I don't know of a moral panic that comes from the left. Thinking of all the historical examples, it's always the conservatives, the ones that won't bend, or like religious people who don't think they can bend, that seem to cause all the moral panics. I'm going to say a truism, which I think needs to always go with this concept of people not bending when society changes, or when anything changes for that matter. Life is change, and change is life. So, if you think that you shouldn't change to fit society, um, and I don't mean on like individual issues, but for things that cause like moral panics, like just LGBTQ rights, for an easy example, those changes are just the changes in society. Resisting those changes in like a violent manner only hurts yourself. It really does. I mean, you'll hurt other people in the process, but the thing it really hurts is you. But yeah, the 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 big thing has always been they talk about, the left pushing their ideology on you. I mean, that's the reason they use terms like gender ideology, gender theory, critical race theory. I can name lots of these if I want to go on. I mean, currently they tend to like to label it DEI, even though, by the way, I'm gonna touch on this because it literally like circles around the same thing. DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they actually add another D to that these days, which is disability. But the reason we have those policies are because we wanted more women in the workplace. They don't like require someone to hire like women, but the policies are there so that like the entire workforce isn't just white men. Cuz that is how the workforce basically looked for a long time. It was just white men, and in like poorer environments where we went to like mistreat people, that's where you had your brown and black men. Uh, for the longest time, women could only work in roles like teachers and nurses and like maybe a governess to teach, you know, kids who were, well, not even just teach, but take care of kids. Or like a maid. Maids were in there too. But those were only respectable jobs for women. We finally, like 70 years ago in the US, got out from that concept that a woman couldn't be anything that she wanted to be. And she was still held back. So that's why we created DI. And now that's expanded to other things too. But when the government talks about getting rid of DEI, what they're talking about is getting rid of women, black people, brown people, any other group that is considered a minority. Yeah, they just are talking about going back to only white men having jobs, which isn't even theoretically possible. But let's get back to the main topic, and I won't go off on tangents anymore. So, uh, there are several theories of the origins of this whole movement. Uh, the first one is about the Catholic Church after the International Conference on Population and Development and the 1995 World Conference on Women, because they didn't want the UN to formally recognize sexual and reproductive rights. They didn't want abortion to be a human right. So, of course, they had to come out with a official statement in their stance. And it enforced distinct roles for the sexes. It had a lot of these buzzwords that we're going to be talking about in it. Uh, Even before that, though, again, the Catholic Church, though this time in the form of a cardinal, uh, had a issue with the popularity of feminist literature from Germany. And he in particular had a big issue with transgender individuals, advocating against it and trying to basically police gender. Which goes back to why I didn't have any idea transgender was even a thing when I was growing up. I blame people like him for why I spent 30 years, well, actually more than 30 years, but basically 30 years having no clue what I was. Uh, but they're not the only ones. In the 1970s, the gay agenda was a term created by a lot of different religious groups. Because the 1970s were like the blossoming of the civil rights movement for the LGBTQ plus community. I wanted to make sure I didn't forget anyone in there. I talked about Stonewall a little while ago, that it only happened a few years before at this point. And obviously, the intolerant religious people had to butt in and have a word to say. But yeah, these terms aren't new. These terms have been around my whole life. These are, in fact, all the different groups that have had issues with making the concept of like gender a mainstream topic. And are those groups that I definitely blame for my own situation. Because yeah, these are the reasons right here why I never knew. And yeah, it's nothing new. They like to say all this gender nonsense, as they call it, is so new. It's never been new. This literally goes back to the 1970s, just in the terminology they are using. So, therefore, it is over 50 years old. It is completely not new. There are some other groups that have a lot of like should I call it hands in the fire to create this situation. One of the biggest ones is groups that tend to call themselves trans exclusionary radical feminists or TERFs. TERFs is the common name. This is where you get, like, your J.K. Rowling's, who is, in fact, a TERF. Uh, she's happy with being called that. But that's just one flavor of people who are called gender-critical feminists. All of these people, none of them is a feminist. They're not about strengthening women. They're about strict gender roles and their place in it. Now, some of these people are like lesbians even, which makes this even more hilarious to me. Because as someone who is both a woman and loves other women, I would never, never force other women into these two categories, and only two categories. I don't believe that there is some need to police women's bodies, which they totally believe. That's why they tend to call, like, trans men having surgery mutilation. And it's a hard thing for me to talk about because I have a lot of words for them, and they don't belong in this video. But I have to call them out here because they're one of the people in the various groups that inflict a lot of this nonsense on us. They're highly organized. They're actually neo-fascists. And technically, they're all anti-feminists, even though they tend to call themselves feminists. But yeah, they don't believe in those policies. What they're about is control. And they do that by creating, how should I put it this? Quasi-scientific research. Like, they'll handpick results that show what they want. That's why, like, the fight against transgender people, specifically kids, getting, like, any sort of medical treatment, even if that's just puberty blockers, ends up being all about how it's, either mutilation, which it's not mutilation, but we're not going into that topic right now. Or it gets into how there are people who detransition, and we have to be so concerned about people who would detransition. Even though detransitioning is about 1%. Now, to put that in context, they make the entire fight about that 1% of our already 1% of the population. So for that 1% of 1%, that's what they make the entire subject about. Even though it helps the other 99%. And even when people detransition, it's correctable. There's nothing that happens that is permanent. At least medically permanent. It can take some effort to change, but yeah. I really, really want to avoid some of these topics because a lot of this goes deep into politics. The groups that are against gender ideology actually are the ones that oppose reproductive rights, in particular, abortion. That's why women bleed out when they have miscarriages here in the US now, in southern states. But somehow they're caring about women as if women bleeding out wasn't some disaster, which is how I view it. Uh, and I'm I'm trying really hard to avoid talking about my opinions on abortion because my mother, my aunts, they lived in a time before abortion was legal in the United States. They knew people and went to school with people who had to have back alley abortions that caused them to die, that caused them to uh, no longer be able to have kids ever again. Things that don't generally happen when you do this same thing in a hospital with actual tools and maybe with someone who's trained as a doctor with facilities there to help. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on abortion and why it needs to be a right. But I'll avoid going into those because that takes us off topic again. Uh, they hate everything about LGBT and our rights, which aren't getting more rights. They're just making us have the same rights as everyone else. I don't want any special treatment. I just want the same treatment. But that's not what I get. That's not at all what I get. I get less. But when they talk about it, it's always, we want so many rights that no one else has. Bitch, that's not the case at all. I just want the same rights you do. I don't think there should be a difference if I'm white or brown. I don't think it should be a difference if I'm cis or trans. I don't think any person is different than any other person. At least not on some intrinsic characteristics. I might think you're different based on your actions, because some people are just plain evil. Really, really evil. But that's getting off topic. They also oppose same sex marriage. They do entire campaigns about gender based violence. And when I say that, that is not just being able to go out and beat up some random trans person. That is allowing men to hurt women in whatever form that takes. They're all for keeping you in a marriage where some guy just beats on his wife left and right, broken bones. Nah, we don't need to let people leave that situation. That's what they say. I have some big issues with that too. Uh, they have campaigns against anti-bullying. They restrict sex education in schools. They want to ban gender studies in higher education. These are the people that created the entire thought of gender ideology. That gender ideology isn't that we are equal. That gender ideology is that we are different, inherently different, and it's pushed by them. There are a lot of lobbies and a huge, huge number of groups that all are part of pushing this. In fact, I could start to go into the different groups, but we would be here for like an hour, and I don't think we want to do that. But I think knowing where these concepts come from is important, which is the whole point of this video. Because I'm always hearing it from my neighbors who, by the way, tend to be right wing. My area of the state is a highly red rural area. So I get a lot of this crap pushed at me. And I'm always hearing how, the left makes me have to say that men are women and that men should be in women's sports. But the left never told you any of that. The right told you that the left said that and did that. When the left, which barely wants to defend trans people, especially in the US recently, uh, they've been, we've been having a big issue with like left leaning political people going, oh, I guess the people don't like trans people, so we're not going to get equal rights for trans people. That's not on our agenda anymore because, they spoke in the last election and said that, even though that's not the case. But that's how they perceived it. It was a good excuse to just drop us off the side. Go, no, we're not helping you anymore. But all of that is part of the conspiracy that mostly lives on the right. It's how you get Donald Trump coming out with his really weird executive order talking about defending women from gender ideology, extremism, and restoring biological truth to the federal government, which is a bunch of crap. I could go into a very long discussion of that. In fact, I think I pretty much did. If you want to go and find my video on what is a woman, I think I pretty much lay that out. But the right is the one that is always talking about this and always pushing it and always bringing it up because they want you to believe what they say is true. And they know if they repeat it often enough, you'll believe it. At least if you're not thinking critically. The thing they hate most is critical thoughts. When people actually think about what they're told in the news or on TV or by their politicians, then they have a harder time getting elected. And they know that. So their whole job is to push their thoughts and their desires onto you. And the more you lean into accepting that gender ideology is a thing, the more you become part of their like fascist ideology. Because this is just one tool in fascism. I mean, we can look back at Nazi Germany and the rise of it. The very first thing they did was get rid of the gay and the trans people. They burnt the world's first gender clinic to the ground. The first books that they burnt when they started their book burning were the journals from the only gender clinic in the world at the time. And that very famous quote that starts with, "They came for the X, and I didn't protect them because I was not X." The very first group that the Nazis came for were the LGBTQ people. And take a wild guess what the fascists are doing right now. Because again, they're going after the very same people. But how it always ends is the same. Because the goals here are the same as they were there. And that's what makes this concept that there's a gender ideology so dangerous. But I will let you go now. I hope you got something out of this. If you did, please put a like down below, a comment, subscribe, any of that, because it helps me out in the YouTube algorithm and more people end up seeing it. All right, I know this was a fairly dark topic, so with that, have fun, take care, and see you later. Bye.